to the Cinematologists podcast 2023 year-end review. In this episode, Neil and Dario discuss 5 films each that they found memorable and meaningful over the past year. They give a couple of honourable mentions and go in depth on 3 films each that were released theatrically in 2023. To find out what they discussed, you'll have to listen to the episode or check out the show notes. But for now, on with the show. Welcome to the Cinematologists podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and joining me, as always, I'm delighted to say, is Dario Linares. Hello, Dario.
Hey, Neil. How you doing? Merry Christmas, or just after Christmas for everyone who's listening to this.
Well, there are 12 days of Christmas, so whenever this lands, which will be in the middle bit, it will still be Christmas. The hangover bit, be that food, socialising, drink, whatever the hangover is that you're suffering from, this will be a tonic, hopefully, for that period. But yes, how are you doing?
I'm okay. I've got the day off today. I sort of took one day early on leave, but I've got quite a big job to do before I completely sign off. I'm examining a PhD sort of remotely, so I've got to finish off kind of reading that and giving the report in. So yeah, I've set myself again, done that wonderful thing where you kind of agree to do something in all good faith, and then it comes to the time you're like, oh my God, I've got to spend the whole weekend doing that before I get a break. But yeah, I'm okay apart from that. How about you?
Yeah, pretty good, have to say. Exhausted. The kids are off school and childcare, so it's absolute carnage as we record this, but it's lovely. And I'm actually looking forward to, kind of spending a little bit of quiet time over the holiday period and managed to get most of the stuff off my desk, actually all the stuff off my desk that I wanted to. So feeling in a pretty good place and looking forward to some festive cheer. But I have to say it's nice to be, talking to you again so soon after the last time as we kind of do our own take on reflecting on the year in film 2023.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I mean, again, for those of you who listened to our last episode, we were sort of talking quite a bit about the apathy of new releases, and it kind of also bled into a conversation about end-of-year lists and positioning yourself in the landscape. But it's funny, I was reflecting last night about sort of what to say as a lead into this. But I think this year we've been less and less influenced, let's say, by what you might call the discourse, whether that's on social media or sort of general conversations. I mean, we did the sort of Berlin thing, and we did London again, but we didn't really talk an awful lot, say, about Barbenheimer and its implications, but potentially for a return to kind of cinema going as a sort of a cultural thing to do. Because obviously there's so many conversations about where the place of cinema going is, and we didn't really talk too much about Killers of the Flower Moon, which was obviously another polemic thing, and really we didn't go into that much detail about the strikes and the sort of future of the industry of writing, really, and the impact of AI. I mean, I guess probably that's just never going to go away, so it will come up at some point. But yeah, an interesting one. I've tried to sort of think about what the year has meant for us on the podcast, and it's been a tricky one, really.
Yeah, I think that's true. There is that, even like take something like the London Film Festival, the films that we saw and talked about were not the highline films necessarily. I think you saw a couple of the the sort of the talked about ones, but we didn't really go out for trying to get, kind of an opinion on all of the big sort of fall, autumn premieres. So I think, even there we've kind of skirted around everything. But I have to say, because of that, when I sort of looked at the films I'd seen this year that were released this year, I felt like even though there's way less on that list of films that I've seen and liked that were released this year than previous years, which obviously we covered on the last episode, I have a greater affinity, I think, for sort of 10 or 12 of them than I probably would normally. I think they've just sat with me more because I've not filled in that space with more and more stuff. So, the films I'm going to talk about today, I didn't have to do any, sort of, I'll just use the word regurgitation, which is not a very nice word, of thought. A lot of the feelings and a lot of things I wanted to talk about were just sat there. And I just think there's more space in my head, which I'm very grateful for at this time of the year, to be like, okay, that felt like a really, really kind of healthy approach, I guess, to the year. And still feeling like that there's a lot to really admire and love and talk about as we sort of move into the next one.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I don't know whether I feel quite the same in terms of there's a sort of tranche of films that I'm like, I'm totally I've seeped into my soul, let's say. But the ones I'm going to talk about, I really loved, and I've taken sort of a couple that stayed with me from really early in the year, and then one from very recently. So as my sort of three main ones that I'm going to talk about. But it's funny then, I think there was a whole sort of middle sort of part of the year where I'd kind of, I thought I talked about it a little bit last week. There was a sort of lull in my motivation to sort of go and watch films, and it wasn't really a lull in the sort of act of watching. It was a lull in that kind of like, oh, well, what does this mean? How can I place this? What do I want to say about it? There was a sort of, there was a bit of a kind of, well, who cares what I say anyway? So, and to be honest with you, I think it's come back again, sort of full circle, when the last couple of episodes, it's been good to talk to you, and really, that's the essence of what we're doing here, isn't it? Where it's just me and you, talking about films, and if people want to listen, that's fine, that's great, that's up to them. And I think also, just sort of even the balance between the conversations that we have and then the other people we have on and the other areas we go into on the podcast. I'm always kind of now thinking through, what I want to do in that regard.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is it's, you either, and this can sound really pretentious, and I don't mean it as grandiose as this, but you either try and enter the flow of a discourse, or you create your own, And I think one of the things we have done on this podcast, which I think is why we've got a listenership that is engaged in the way that they are, is that we have to some extent created our own conversations about this stuff, and the messages I get certainly are appreciative of the fact that we're talking about different types of films, or we're talking about them in a different kind of way. So and I think stepping out of that flow has definitely been beneficial to me, and hopefully there'll be some films today that will sort of introduce or reintroduce, I think, to people in terms of things they might have missed, or things that have been out for a while that they're just nowhere in the conversation at the end of year because they're not up for any kind of Oscar, or they're not near the top of the best list because they didn't necessarily play festivals this year, or any festivals at all in some case.
Yeah, that's the other thing to say, I think, is that there's a lot of films that I've seen, and the ones at Berlin and London, that are not out yet, and they probably would have been. I might have had a completely different list, to be honest with you, if I'd have sort of stuck with films that I'd just seen, and instead of ones that I kept to ones that were UK releases in 2023. And I'll think about it next year. I like that idea of approaching film watching in a different way. I might even just focus on films that I've seen at the cinema rather than streaming, and just sort of go in that direction, or even do what I think you were mentioning somebody did that you talked about, where it was just new films that were new to them, and they're not necessarily new films, which I like that idea as well. So I might sort of, as a cliched New Year's resolution or new approach to watching, just to kind of think, actually, how can I organize the bombardment of everything.
Yeah.
I'm just going to do it in this way for this year. And in terms of I think it's not as if there's rules to watching anything, but just in terms of, okay, I'm going to kind of concern myself with thinking through and writing about these kinds of films, and then podcasting about them as well. But shall we do our honorable mentions first? I mean, what we're going to do is we've got a couple of films each, which I think we're just going to briefly mention, and then we'll go on to sort of top three each that we'll go into in a bit more depth.
Yep, that sounds good. Yeah, so they are, I guess it's honorable mention is probably a weird phrase, isn't it? Because there aren't, I guess it's just a level of depth in terms of things to focus on, because I've tried not to rank, although I do have a clear favourite film this year, but so it's kind of like, but then how else to, I don't really know how else to say it, like, because I'm not going to talk as much about these two films, but
sure,
these were two films I wanted to mention because I think, well, for different reasons, what really like. So I didn't include any films that I saw at festivals last year that released this year in any kind of reflection. So Ennis Main and One Fine Morning were last year films for me. Our good friend Mark also made two films this year, two shorts, and one of them was for the BFI's Film on Film season. And it was called A Dog Called Discord, which is, and the reason I picked the two films I'm going to talk about together, because the other film is Christine Malloy and Joe Lawler's The Future Tense, which is on Mubi, and Mark's film is on BFI Player for free, actually. You don't even need to be a subscriber. Is that, just two really beautiful examples of kind of personal filmmaking that is not kind of solipsistic and kind of sort of gratuitous, but really kind of critically engaged with the why of the art that the filmmakers make. And I think that visually and aesthetically they're very different. The Dog Called Discord is kind of Mark looking into his own relationship with celluloid and sort of celluloid filmmaking and his love of celluloid in a really beautiful short that was kind of just a kind of mystery movie, really, as he sort of tries to work out what's on this kind of undeveloped roll of film and then track down a dog and the owners of the dog that appears in the film. And it's just so beautiful. I think it's one of my favorite things he's done. It's kind of just really fun and engaging. And on another note, The Future Tense is Christine and Joe sort of analysing their own Irishness, analysing their kind of conflicted relationship to Britishness, because they have a daughter sort of born here. They live in London. They've lived here for a long time. And it's sort of a post-Brexit kind of soul-searching in terms of where are they? That kind of liminal space for a lot of people who move, no longer at home and no home in the new place. But it's never a kind of maudlin, woe is us kind of thing. It's really funny. And it also kind of encompasses their own relationship to how they make films and why they make films. And there's a lovely commentary on it throughout in terms of them reflecting on the making of this film as we're kind of watching it. And both the films reminded me of a quote that I read, I think it was earlier this year, maybe it was late last year, which was Kent Jones writing about Goddard when Goddard died, so it must have been last year. And he quotes Wallace Stevens, who said that the subject of the poem is always the poem. And Kent Jones says, and the same can be said of cinema, like, the cinema always, the subject of cinema that it always returns to is the cinema itself. And I've just become more and more sort of obsessed by that quote, but also the idea of seeing the cinema in things, and watching stuff and feeling like you're in the hands of filmmakers who are very aware that you're watching a film and are interested in your experience of watching the film, while they're also kind of working through either a narrative or non-fiction kind of story or set of ideas. And both those films for me this year were just really beautiful examples of that, where the filmmakers are aware that you're watching a film and they want you to enjoy that aspect of it, as well as, and obviously, it seems kind of obvious, but so much of what those films are about, be that nostalgia or kind of, personal practice or people's place in the world, a family, kind of past relationships, it all comes out in such an interesting way when it's handled with such dexterity. So those were my two. If you haven't seen them, check them out. They're both kind of readily available and they're both just absolutely wonderful Wonderful films.
We're flying from Stansted to Dublin. It's a journey we've done a lot over the years. It immediately brings me back to when we got on a ferry and left Ireland for Britain. Do I mean Britain, or do I mean Great Britain, or the UK? This confusing mix of terms is a reminder of something difficult, a colonial past, a reminder of atrocities, messy.
Over the past few years, our feelings about England have changed. Its roads, parks, monuments no longer feel innocuous. Can you place a feeling on a country?
Shit. We're about to land.
What about you?
Yeah, great choices there. It's interesting because I think that there is a connecting point here, and maybe we can sort of expand a little bit on this idea of filmmakers making personal films. And what's interesting is that I think that there are obviously there are different brackets of that, and I think that those two films you've chosen there, are sort of deeply personal in the sort of experiential sense, and then there are politics that tie into that, and then there are other films that are more, they're personal, but they're expressly political because it's in a given situation, an immediate event or problem or set of circumstances that's going on in the world right now. And then I think more and more, you get these films that are big films, big ticket films that are made by people who talk about them as if they're deeply personal. I mean, just the one that sort of springs to mind is Maestro, which I saw at the London Film Festival, which, as far as it goes, I haven't got really any problems with, but it really is a sort of tick box of, biopic by the numbers stuff, even though it's really well done. And I think that there is there's a real sort of self-regard. I mean, I quite like Bradley Cooper, but that sort of sense of placing himself in these roles as Maestro kind of thing, I think there's a sort of double meaning there that maybe is quite, problematic. And there's just watching a film like that and then returning, and then thinking about something like The Future Tense, the sort of level of phoniness of a lot of big Hollywood stuff just it doesn't work with me anymore in a way. But just to link to a couple of films then that kind of speak to what you're talking about. So my first sort of mention is My Imaginary Country, which is Patricio Guzman's latest documentary. I don't know whether it's going to be his last film. I haven't actually checked out if he's making anything. But, this is a guy that's been documenting the socio-politics of Chile for 50 years. And this film is a sort of elegiac reportage of a women-led Chilean demonstration that took place in 2019. And it was triggered by something as banal as a price increase on the subway. And that led to, huge demonstrations and demands for social democracy, education, healthcare, jobs, all of that stuff. And, a lot of it goes back to the history of Chile, but he doesn't sort of return to that and give it that wider context, because I think he's probably accepted the fact that anybody who knows his films knows that he's sort of, covered that quite a lot. But I really enjoyed this because the voiceover was almost a sort of resignation to the fact that he's gotten older now and he's still fighting the same battle, but he hasn't got the energy anymore. And it's almost a kind of change from his poetic philosophy that you'll see in Nostalgia for the Light, which is my favorite film of his, which has given way to this more sort of prosaic, more kind of observation of, look at what the young people are doing now. They're still fighting, particularly this sort of women-led activism, which sort of places more of the onus on the fact that the lack of kind of democratic accountability or democratic structure was very much kind of patriarchal in that sense. But it's amazing to look at as well. Some incredible aerial shots and what you might call sort of documentary action sequences, which are sort of caught on the fly. And the reason I sort of wanted to mention this was because I saw just the other day 20 Days in Mariupol, which is obviously the sort of observational documentary set in the Ukraine. And that should be on everybody's list, basically, because it's scene after scene of devastating imagery that we haven't seen a lot of, I don't think, in the coverage of the Ukraine war. And just the sort of incredible bravery of the doctors and nurses and obviously the harrowing, unflinching camera showing people sort of, being operated on with equipment that is around and about that they can find. And obviously the bravery of the journalists who decided to stay when they're getting bombed. And I think that this is perhaps, a more urgent documentary than the Guzman one. But I just think, they're both of a piece in terms of that kind of political reportage doc. So both of those are worth seeing. Then the other film that I just wanted to mention just quickly was one I saw back in Berlin, which was called Samsara, directed by Lois Patino. And it's I talked about it in the Berlin episode, but it's set in Laos and at the beginning anyway, and it's these teenagers are all kind of living, studying together in a Buddhist temple, and one of them it just shows one of them crossing a river every day to read a text to an elderly woman who's kind of on her deathbed, as it were, and he's trying to help her he's almost kind of like the guide of finding her way to the afterlife, because obviously sort of, this sort of Buddhist context in terms of what comes after death. But then when the woman actually does die, the film sort of structurally changes, and there's this moment where a text on screen, I mean, I was watching this in the auditorium, obviously in Berlin, and a text comes on screen saying, "Please close your eyes and now join in this journey to the afterlife." And it becomes a kind of end of 2001 sort of light show with your eyes closed and these flashing lights going on for about 20 minutes. And it's really kind of effective. It has this sort of, real hallucinatory or mindful or taking you to a sort of another place effect. And I really did think it worked. If I can imagine people in the audience going, well, this is bullshit. You know what I mean? I can't be doing with this crap. But I really sort of gave myself over to it. And then you come back and the whole sort of final section is set in Africa among these animals. And we just follow these animals kind of like wandering around and being looked after, and the sort of people in the villages there. And it's really just like, it really is not like nothing you've ever seen before. And if you kind of go with it, it really is interesting to watch. And I'm not really a spiritual or religious person, but I kind of dug what it was trying to do with the form. And I don't know whether anybody will be able to see it, but it's if you do, just check it out, because it's completely unique, I would say.
ลูกอ่านปึมไปฮอดซะแล้ว
ยังว่าของกระยานอ่านสิบ่จบคือกันต้องมีคนอ่านให้เราฟัง
การเวลาบ่สิ้นสุดออกจากห่างกายหนึ่งไปสู่ห่างกายใหม่โลกเปิดกว้างสำหรับคนที่เปิดหับไฟยัว
อ้าวไอ้จัวจะไปเซ่มาเขาซอกจะเป็นทิศแล้วไอ้จัวถ้านอนใน1 ชั่วโมงเดียวนะ
ข้อขอบใจสิ่งศักดิ์สิทธิ์ทั้งหลายสำหรับความฝันเรื่องราวดีๆจะเกิดขึ้นเมื่อเฮานอนหลับ
ต่อไปเจ้าจะเบิ่งแผ่นดินคนที่เจ้าหักสุสานของเจ้า และเจ้าจะคิดว่าค่อยจะเห็นเราได้เมื่อเสียชีวิตแล้วมันจะงดงามเพียงใดเมื่อได้ไปเกิดในห้างใหม่
Cool. Yeah, I remember you saying about that, and it hasn't. I don't think it's popped up anywhere yet, so I haven't seen it anywhere. I'm excited to try and have that similar experience. I saw My Imaginary Country at Cannes last year, and it was interesting because he had another film out last year which was Cordillera of Dreams, which is much closer to Nostalgia for the Light and the Pearl Button, and it was interesting to see like you say, a very different kind of Guzman film where it's not a kind of long gestating kind of philosophical idea film, like Cordillera Dreams is about the mountain range, and he's kind of doing similar things in terms of how he's linking sort of past and present Chile through landscape and through time. Whereas, and that was kind of like one of the things I really enjoyed about My Imaginary Country is because it is an old filmmaker just kind of picking up a camera, picking up a drone, going back home and just seeing what the hell's going on. And there are those sort of nuggets of ways of thinking which are uniquely him, but it is a very, very different kind of experience. And I just love that. And again, because that's his Chile is his project, so something as kind of substantial as the protests and the kind of the writing of the new constitution is going to be something he's obviously going to be deeply interested in. But it didn't feel false. It didn't feel like, oh, hey, I'm going to exploit this moment. It was like, of course he's going to be there because he's been there for so much of sort of post-Pinochet sort of accounting.
Yeah. And it was almost as if he was giving his platform over as well, which I thought was nice. You know what I mean? It was like,
for sure.
I'm actually just going to be a facilitator here. This is not about my vision in a way, which takes quite a lot of, understanding of the self, that he does have a role in Chile, but yet this was somebody else's story. And even though it did have a voiceover, he was kind of like, clear in that sense, I think, in the voiceover and sort of realizing he wasn't the avant-garde anymore, which again takes a lot of sort of self-understanding, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Hopefully that comes to all of us with age, Dario.
Yeah, that's true. Well, yeah, I don't think I've ever been the avant-garde, so there we go.
I'm a mouth guard. That's what I am.
Yeah. I'm always on guard, though. Enough of these jokes. Never mind.
It's Christmas.
Yeah, no, it's the time for crap jokes. You're right. So, do you want to go first? Do you want to talk us through? I mean, just to say before we start, I mean, you sent me your list, and actually, there was a couple of films that would have been on my kind of like long list, as it were. So I've sort of adapted. Particularly one would definitely have been on my top three, but I've adapted. So I've got something to say about it, which is good. But I kind of adapted around yours, which is great because it means that we're kind of agreeing on a couple of these films anyway. But you go ahead.
I'll probably go kind of chronologically in order of release then, or at least in terms of when I think they were released. Because the first one I'm going to talk about is the Swiss film Unrest, which I read about it, heard about it last year at festivals. And it just sounded fantastic. And it was one of those films on podcasts that I just loved the way people talked about it. People were just kind of blown away by its kind of simplicity and, horrible word in terms of the context of the film, but precision, which will become clear when we sort of mention the synopsis. But, but people were just like, wow, this is a really interesting film. So I was kind of like really keen to see it. And then, like so much, no real release for it, and then it just popped up on Mubi this year in the spring. And I literally, it was one of those rare occasions like, okay, I'm going to make this as a priority. And I just thought it was absolutely kind of stunning, really. It's the story of watchmakers in Switzerland, the Swiss mountains. I think it's in the 1920s, maybe the 1910s, 1920s. And it's a kind of collision of their sort of socialist anarchist awakening in terms of kind of global movements that sort of hit this town, particularly sort of Italian anarchism, and Russian, in sort of this kind of figure of Kropotkin, who kind of is this sort of observer. He's come to observe and sort of report and sort of develop sort of communist ideas, and also kind of a burgeoning capitalism where it's a move from kind of a very simple, small, handmade, kind of bespoke item to something which is more mass produced and has more, so that's this kind of efficiencies are everywhere, and they're kind of trying to shave off seconds, and everyone's judged on how many bits they can do a day and stuff. And it's this collision. But what's so interesting about it is how it's very quiet, it's very slow. It doesn't lean into a grandiose statement about this kind of war between ideas. It's very much about a slow awakening of a people really who are kind of brought in to work in these factories from this village and slowly realize what they're being asked to do and how they're being asked to do it, and how they're sort of slowly being essentially dehumanized and turned into cogs, literally, with these kind of very, very specific mundane roles. And what was really wonderful was about the metaphor of the watches, obviously, is and the sort of the clock pieces is kind of, a little on the nose, but very apt in terms of, time is everywhere in this town. Everything's measured in terms of time, and the slow realization that people's time is essentially being taken from them in these kind of really exploitative ways, and that they're being seen as units of time. That's all they're being seen as, and how their kind of socialist imagination is awakened. It's a wonderful movie, and it's great because it's kind of under 2 hours. The performances are fantastic. It's kind of, it's really smartly written. When I watched it, I was kind of, what I loved about it as a screenwriter was like, I felt like this had been so well researched in terms of the period and the people in that location. And it wasn't an academic piece, but it felt really, really well observed and really well lived in. And I just thought, oh God, I love spending time in this place with these characters, even though it's very much an ensemble piece and it's not about the kind of classic one person leads a revolution. It's not all about that at all. It's very much a kind of how revolutionary movements can emerge when sort of the conditions are sort of predisposed to it. And I just wish people had seen it more, and it popped up more, because I think like it's such a unique film in terms of its relationship to its subject and how it's put together. I just thought it was fantastic.
À vrai dire, je comprends toujours pas ce que vous faites exactement.
Je produis la onloi, c'est le cœur de la montre.
Different. I have arrived in the Swiss Jura Mountains. The valley is, with no doubt, the capital point of the International Anarchist Rotation Circle.
La nation, c'est un fantôme. Une société anarchiste existe toujours.
Puis en fait, c'était la première fois que les femmes aient gagné le même salaire comme les hommes. Après, ils se sont tous tués.
Donc pour la patrie, mettez la main à l'émotion. Bravo, félicitations.
Vous lisez pas la presse anarchiste? Grâce à leur réseau télégraphique, j'ai pu anticiper la crise et sauver des parts.
Arrêtez, entrez pas dans les matchs open.
Kropotkin, Piotr. Ah, Saint-Pétersbourg. Quel est le motif de votre voyage?
Gemäss einer Mitgliederliste und der Fotografie hier haben wir Grund zur Annahme, dass die 4 erwähnten Arbeitskräfte Mitglieder dieser lokalen anarchistischen Association sind. Gemäss paragraphe 3, article 6 du règlement actualisé, une telle adhésion entraîne un licenciement inconditionnel
extra langsam gemacht. Qui, eux, sont provoqués par l'échappement. C'est le mouvement qui revient et qui part et qui revient et qui part. Et des deux côtés, il y aura des impulses qui vont définir cette vitesse. Et en disant le crédit,
Je pense.
And I know you've seen it as well, haven't you?
Yeah, it's funny actually. I've just literally pulled up our webpage for the London Film Festival from last year. And there's like, I didn't even register, but that's where we interviewed Lola and Malloy about the future tense. So, you can go back and listen to that interview just to plant that in, because I know obviously we didn't mention it before when we were talking about it. But there are several films on here on this list that have made it onto our end of year list this year. So it's funny how that has taken place.
Yeah,
and those films have remade, and Unrest was one of those. And I talked to Savina about it. It was just one of these things where you're kind of like, this is clearly a concept film in some ways, but it's so true to itself in that, the mechanisms of time and the mechanisms of time in the content of the movie are mapped on so perfectly to the way the film is made. And there's those great shots of the camera is just kind of still, and the people are sort of measuring the distance from one place to another because they want to know exactly how long it will take a worker to get from one side of the town to the other across the mountain, kind of thing. And they're arguing about which sort of time they're using, because that's one of the funny things. They've got like 4 variations of time, and they've got to kind of figure out which one they're adhering to. And yeah, it's just a sort of brilliant, unsatirical sort of meta commentary on the way that time sort of dominates all of our lives. And it's got and it does build it does do that great thing of building a world that doesn't feel like it is a sort of period drama, theatrical presentation in that sense. It's quite literary, I think, in some ways in that way. But yeah, and also the sort of underlying politics of it all is again not on the nose, I don't think. But you can see that sort of sense of, the exploitation and the use of time as an instrument to define where people should be and what they should be doing. And if they're outside of those time frameworks, then it's like criminalized. It's really a fascinating film.
Yeah, that's a nice point about the kind of the meta commentary. I think that's really, really well put. Yeah, and then how I remember that being about the time. They always use different time zones, and then there's a power outage, isn't it? So they become stranded in time because no one knows what the time is or what time to follow. Yeah, it's
what time is. Yeah.
So let's go with one of yours now.
Yeah, sure. So again, this one was one that I saw last year, but has been released this year. So this is Laura Poitras's compelling, provocative, and again, talking about precision, expertly constructed documentary, All the Beauty in the Bloodshed. So this is about the personal life, the artistic development and career, and then the political activism of photographer Nan Goldin. So, it kind of, it moves around a little bit chronologically, but it intercedes the story of Goldin's political activism with her development as a photographer and the early stages of her life and the sort of trauma of her family. So there is that sort of element of we're going to look at an artist's life part of it. But it kind of starts off with by sort of saying in 2014, Goldin was prescribed OxyContin to deal with sort of pain in her wrist, really. So something quite minor, but almost sort of overnight she became addicted. And following a difficult and, more or less ongoing recovery, which has meant she's had to take other drugs to try and get off OxyContin, she began working with campaigners to try and get some kind of accountability from the Sacklers, who are, I think most people will know now, are the owners of Purdue Pharma, the producers of OxyContin, and basically, the people who are sort of blamed for this regime of upselling to doctors OxyContin, which has led to the opioid crisis in the United States, right? But the crossover is really clever and really interesting. I mean, it's obvious because it's just there that the Sacklers are huge donators through the years. So that them now, the ones that are around now, but their parents, who obviously started the pharmacological kind of corporate wing of where all their money comes from. But they're huge donators to arts organizations across the world. So, the Louvre, the Tate, Met Museum, Guggenheim, and the London Portrait Gallery, National Portrait Gallery in London. And obviously, Goldin's work has become famous throughout the world, and she's got work in many of these galleries. So as part of her activist strategy, which is kind of twofold. So she works for this activist group called PAIN. The acronym, escapes me right now. But anyway, what they did was a lot of direct action against the galleries and museums. So, like, for example, just sort of throwing empty OxyContin bottles all over the place and prescriptions and stuff like that, and sort of filming it as a kind of performance art intervention. But also leveraging the fact that she has works in these institutions of herself. And the first one was with the National Portrait Gallery, where they were going to show a retrospective of her work. But she said to them, I don't want my work in here if you're going to accept this £1 million donation from the Sacklers, which was in the process of being sort of accepted, right? So Poitras really expertly weaves together this portrait of the artist, who's essentially a sort of punk photographer who arrived in the sort of 70s and 80s and, shot a lot of her personal experiences with the underground sort of subcultural communities and sort of scenes that she was involved with. A lot of it is quite harrowing. She was a sex worker. She was friends with a lot of artists who, again, were at the avant-garde but sort of going into the 1980s, they were part of the sort of gay and trans subculture, and obviously AIDS hit hard when that arrived. So there was a lot of sort of most of her photography is a sort of exploration of the self, and again, a lot of it comes from the trauma of her early family years and the sort of a lack of acceptance from her mother. But it really demonstrates, the film is great in sort of demonstrating this uncompromising and unflinching eye, and takes its time to show these photo series. So it's not as if there's just one photo that, is given all the kudos. She works in these kind of photo series, which the film does show at length, and they're really effective. And I think what it does also is it shows the idea of sort of still image series can have a place in the cinema auditorium if it's sort of positioned right. It's not just a gallery thing. I think you don't sort of lose interest in seeing these one films over another. And the first one, the sort of and probably maybe the most famous is the Ballad of Sexual Dependency, and which captures these sort of really intimate moments, these sort of experiences of pain and sex and drug use, and the bonding of these characters on the outside, and then showing also without flinching, as I say, sort of domestic violence and the ravages of AIDS, and its aesthetic is definitely not nostalgic. It's almost anti-nostalgic view of the past, which is why they're so powerful, because it sits completely against that sort of nostalgic aesthetic that we see all the time in film today. And just the end sequence is so infuriating with they get the eventually, I mean, again, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, they get the Sacklers on a Zoom call sitting there, and they've had to settle and pay $6 billion, and they're still billionaires, and they're sat there with their stony faces as the parents of the dead children describe the details of their loss. And it's as riveting and infuriating a scene as you get, with these rich people who just couldn't care less. But yeah, a great documentary. I think that is a fascinating portrait of an artist, but also, you know, sort of politically really relevant.
Photography is like a flash of euphoria, and it gave me a voice. Once I started sharing the work, it was really heavy resistance, especially from male artists and gallerists who said, this isn't photography. Nobody photographs their own life.
Dance, dance, dance. Talk, talk. It's a photographer named Golden. She's a major name in the art world.
The work was incredibly political.
Probably my whole life, the struggle to fight conformity and denial.
100,000 dead! 100,000 dead! There's the Sackler family of the art world, the museum world, and philanthropy. And then there's the big pharma marketing and addiction and death.
My anger at the Sackler family, it's personal. When you think of the profit of people's pain, you can only be furious.
Nan said, I think we should take these people down. But do you think my career will implode? And I said, probably.
We need to demand that the Met Museum, the Louvre, the Tate refuse donations from the Sacklers and take down their name.
The rich people are scared that we're going to dig into the evil way they made money. You grow up being told that didn't happen. You didn't see that. How do you trust yourself? And so that's the reason I take pictures.
This is a watershed moment. People are actually beginning to rethink how we do things.
The wrong things are kept secret in society. And that destroys people.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I've not seen it. I did notice the other day, though, that Criterion are putting it out next year. So it's obviously already a film.
All right. It's on BBC iPlayer, actually.
Oh, is it? Oh, well, that's great. Okay. I'll watch that over Christmas then. Yeah, great. That's really good to know. Thank you. Yeah. It definitely feels like a film that is already, considered a kind of high watermark of kind of contemporary political and personal filmmaking. Because I think Golden was heavily involved, wasn't she? In terms of it as Poitras has talked about it as a kind of collaborative work as much as
Yeah. It is. Yeah.
So my next film is also about relationships, and it's called The Eight Mountains, and it's by Felix van Groeningen and Charlotte Vandermeersch, who made a film I really, really love called The Broken Circle Breakdown. I think it was like 2013, 2014.
Yeah.
And this is the story of two Italian boys who sort of see each other each summer after they sort of meet in the mountains. One of the boys is kind of based in Turin, and each summer they go to this kind of little sort of summer apartment that his parents buy, and he meets a friend who's based in them, who lives in the mountains. And it's a story of friendship. It's a story of male friendship, and it sort of spans sort of 2 or 3 decades, and it's just an absolutely beautiful film. Like, it really not like I don't really have a kind of intellectual take on it. I just think it's so beautifully crafted and beautifully performed, and it's just a wonderful story. Like, it's so the reason I wanted to talk about it is, I mean, I loved it, but also so part of the story is that the boy from Turin, and I can't remember his name now. I'm going to find his name because this is good job I'm editing this.
Yeah.
So there's Pietro, who's played when he's older by Luca Marinelli, who was so brilliant in Martin Eden. And Pietro, when he's sort of late teenager, sort of in his early 20s, becomes estranged from his father, and doesn't see his father for years. And then his father dies. Not a spoiler. It happens reasonably early. It's a long film, but reasonably early. And Pietro learns that his father sort of bought this kind of plot of land with a really busted hut, old sort of stone hut on the side of the mountain where they used to visit. And his friend Bruno, sort of Pietro's young friend Bruno, who's he learns that he'd had this relationship with his dad, and they'd spent a lot of time together over the years, climbing mountains together. And Bruno is a kind of construction worker, an amazing builder who sort of has dreams of being a farmer. But my favourite part of the film is, Pietro is a kind of, at this point, quite a spoiled city dweller, very kind of full of rage and anger against his dad, kind of very wayward, no real sort of plan or kind of direction in his life. And when he sort of finds this place, he's like, what am I going to do with it? And Bruno sort of suggests that they build it together. So they build this in honor of, Pietro's dad and sort of Bruno's sort of surrogate dad. So over the course of a summer, they build this house on the side of a mountain, and the film sort of slows down while they build it, and sort of that's where they sort of really reconnect from their young childhood days and sort of establish a friendship which then sort of spans across the rest of the film. And Pietro slowly finds his way, and they keep returning to this house on the mountain, and so much happens in between, and their lives change, and it's so beautiful and moving. But it's just that sequence where that sort of segment of the film where they're building the house is just glorious. Really, it slows down. Where it's shot on the side of the mountain, and it's just the production value of being able to get where they got as filmmakers is just absolutely glorious. It's such a pleasurable experience to spend time in this location. And then, of course, what is always ever present is this kind of sublime aspect where Bruno will not leave the mountains. Like, he's born in the mountains, he's raised in the mountains, he's from mountain stock, and he's very proud of it. And he's kind of angry at his dad and his granddad, I think, for kind of, seeking work and a life that didn't involve the mountains, and he wants to kind of return to that. But of course, as beautiful as this place is, it's also incredibly, arguably, inhospitable a lot of the times of the year, and incredibly dangerous. And that kind of hangs over in this really kind of, kind of naturally ominous way of like this, that sort of Burke's idea of the sublime, this kind of huge spectacle of nature which sits there and is so difficult to comprehend in terms of its actual power, and it's something that kind of attracts Pietro, who kind of goes off and tries to climb, who spends his life as I think he's a travel writer. It's unclear what he's writing, but he becomes a writer. And it's just an extraordinarily beautiful film to look at, amazing performances, and does this really wonderful thing in the middle of sort of having these two men build a house, and everything that the story kind of needs to work is in that sequence. I just thought it was a stunning piece of storytelling, in that part in particular. And then the rest of the film just always returns to this space which has been so beautifully crafted on screen for us as an audience. It just works so well.
Non pensavo di trovare un amico come Bruno nella vita. Né che l'amicizia fosse un luogo dove metti le tue radici e che resta ad aspettarti.
Ciao Bruno. Ciao Pietro. Negli ultimi 10 anni con mio padre non ci ho mai parlato. Lo so, mi parlava di me. Quando tuo papà l'ha vista, ha voluto costruire la casa qua. Ha chiesto a me di costruirla. L'unica cosa che mi serve è il manovale.
You were looking into the blue.
stato contento di quello che stai facendo, sai?
Che questo qua vive sulla cima delle montagne, no? Però i problemi di noi comuni mortali non li conosce mica.
Vorrei aiutarlo.
Non puoi aiutare uno che non vuole essere aiutato.
Just a flash of light in the endless night, then it's done.
Volevo trasformarmi, evolvere, partire. Guarda che c'è un mondo fuori da qui. Non preoccuparti per me.
Yeah, you know I loved it. I sort of mentioned it, didn't I? That it would be one for you, I thought. But I kind of, when I talked about it with you, I paired it with the with Godland in a way, because I think that sort of reflection of the relationship between the sort of man and the land kind of thing. There was a sort of interesting parallel there, but this is kind of almost sort of more, yeah. I mean, the use of the word sublime is good, because it kind of taps into that idea of, you know, we're all sort of minuscule in the grand scheme of things, whether it's nature or the cosmos or anything, without being, and it never sort of goes into that in any sort of, you know, direct detail. But this guy's just sort of like, I am of the land stuff, and I'm meant to be here, and everything else is sacrificed to that, and he can't kind of fathom why everyone else isn't like that, you know what I mean? Or that people are sort of seeking a sense of the world in a much more constructed way. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you know, you go off and be a travel writer, or, you know, we've got even when he gets married and like has a kid and stuff like that, and she's like, we need to make a business out of this, and it's got to work because we've got to feed our kids. You know, that sense of there's a civilization aspect to all of our lives, that and he's like the ultimate, I'm just going to go live in a cave, but you know, this is a house on a mountain kind of thing, and I'll deal with whatever comes, and like I don't need electricity and stuff like that. And it's kind of like, you know, a sort of state of nature thing into the wild kind of aspect to him that is really, on the one hand, kind of, you got to respect it, but it's kind of, you know, narcissistic and unrealistic, I think, as well at the same time. And I think that's where the sort of the tension in the relationship lies as well, isn't it? Because I think it feeds into that idea of what the male role is, because they both sort of have this interesting relationship with his father and their own as well. And it's kind of like, you know, where do I want to be? How do I position myself? How do I know I've made the right decisions? How do I know that my life is meaningful? And he just the sort of the character from who is in love with him. I forget his name now. I know the other guy's Pietro. What's the name of the guy who's sorry. So yeah, Bruno is kind of like solves that conundrum by just being so ingrained in that sense of his belonging. But I mean, there's sort of moments where you don't know whether he actually believes that. He's just performing it because what else is there? Do you know what I mean? But you know, it's just, and like you say, you can intellectualize a film like this, but my God, it's just, it is a sort of mood film in that sense, where, you know, it's the mountains and you're up in this, in watching them sort of build this house and thinking, yeah, God, I'm stuck on Zoom calls all day long. Wouldn't it be great to have that kind of life? So it does have that kind of effect on you. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, a great film.
Yeah, and there's that sequence where Pietro brings some friends up from the city, and that there's this kind of real crystallization of the fact that the world has moved on, and Bruno's kind of snarky about their idea of like living in a place like that. Yeah. He's kind of like, but the reality is, that they do represent where the world has shifted to, and they might have this kind of really bourgeois and kind of like expecting stuff to be flown in on a drone kind of experience, or idea of living somewhere like that. But the reality is, that Bruno knows that is the world and that he is not part of it. And one of the reasons that he stays in the mountains is because he just knows he can't fit in. He can't make the shift. The world has made the shift that he can't make. Then it kind of has this kind of sadness there, and is ultimately tragic because he can never do that. And while they might be naive to what that place actually is, he's not naive because I think you're right. I think he does know actually, this is all I've got, so I'm just gonna I'm gonna go 100% on it. Which is So what's next for you?
Yeah, so again, maybe there's some sort of connecting tissue here. So my next film is Past Lives by Celine Song. Now, I'm going to talk about this with the realization this morning that this is The Guardian's #1 film as well, so I'm kind of reticent to be so middlebrow. But yeah, I saw this at Berlin, and it's kind of been my favorite film all year in a way. And it's really weird to try and deconstruct why that is. Which I'll try and do now. So it's set in 3 sections. It starts off with these 2 characters, two young kids, Na Young and Hai Sung, who are 12-year-old classmates, and are kind of like they develop this sort of very sweet and innocent relationship. They want to have a kind of play date, and at the beginning of the film, they're in this they're seen having this playground. They have a conversation with their parents. I like this boy and stuff like that. And the parents get together and they bring them to this playground and they're playing and stuff. And then it's revealed that the parents of the girl are going to emigrate to America. I think it's Canada first and then America. So this sort of first section kind of ends with a beautiful sequence of them sort of going off in different directions, one up some stairs and one down the street. And it's filled with lovely, unpretentious sort of framings and cinematic moments in this film, I think. And then we move forward sort of 12 years later, and they find each other through social media, through Facebook. And what's great about, another thing that's sort of great about this movie is that, again, in each of the sections, they're sort of 12 years apart, and the movie just goes 12 years later twice. So in this middle section, it really sort of taps into that moment, I think, a few years ago when there was a sort of almost a sort of innocence about what the internet would allow us to do in terms of friendship and getting back in contact with each other, and we didn't really, the sort of consequences of that when it first started, nobody really could think about what the internet would become and what social media would become. It was just like, oh yeah, I'll get back in touch with so-and-so that I knew I knew back at school. And it really does a great job of sort of showing them sort of rebuilding their relationship with each other across time and across, he's still back in Seoul and she's in New York. And they sort of build this back up, and they're, finding out about each other's lives. And then she comes to this realization that they're not going to be able to see each other, for work reasons and for life reasons. And so she sort of breaks it off again. And then sort of at this moment, she meets a guy that she's an artist residence with. She's a playwright, right? And she meets another artist played by John Magaro, is it?
Magaro, yeah.
John Magaro. Yeah. And then we move 12 years later again, and she's married to this guy, and they've built a life together. They're both writers. They're both in New York. She's exactly where she's supposed to be. But for it doesn't explain this. You just realize that the guy from Seoul is coming to visit New York, right? And, all throughout this, there's these sort of conversations about the relationship at different portions of this expanse of time. And there's nothing particularly sort of, like complex or sophisticated about this. But in the final sequence, the guy comes to visit, and they have this sort of conversation as they go and see the sights in New York. And, it's that typical thing. She lives in New York and she's never been to the Statue of Liberty or whatever, and she takes him around and what have you. And all the time, it's kind of just building up this sense of her thinking about her own identity, her own Koreanness. There's a great sequence where she's sort of talking about it, you know, oh, he's so Korean, and it's kind of like she's trying to figure out what she is in relationship to that. And then it also plays around really beautifully with its own sense of it being a romantic drama. There's this one scene where they're in bed together, and the husband sort of says, you know, you realize if this was a movie, I'd be the evil character in here, and he's going to come and visit and take you away, and that would be the happy ending to the story. So it's kind of knowing in that way, which is great. And it just builds and builds and builds to this ending. And again, spoiler, they go out for dinner, and there's this really sort of awkward sequence where they're speaking to each other in Korean, and the husband is sort of sitting on the side, completely out of this conversation. And we as an audience are privileged to hear what they're saying through the subtitles, but he doesn't. And what that does is it gives us a real empathy for his position, but also we're privy to their conversation about, you know, the lives that they didn't have. And I think the last scene, she sort of returns, she drops him off, he takes an Uber back to the airport, and he's going to go back to Seoul, and she goes back to the husband and just bursts into tears, crying. And it's kind of like, you think to yourself, what is she crying over? Because, and like, it's really emotional, I think, as well, because she's already said she's where she's supposed to be. You know, she's not going to run away with him. But I think she's sort of crying over the alternate life that she could have had. And I think, you know, it's just a brilliant way of showing that there's 1,000 different lives that we could have had if we'd made different decisions. But she's because she's managed to be close to this alternate life, she can kind of see it in front of her. And she's sort of mourning it, you know, mourning this opportunity or this completely parallel universe that she could have been in, and she can see in front of her, but she isn't. And it just really affects you, I think, because, you know, there's definitely one moment in my life, or one sort of segment of my life, which if I'd have taken a certain decision, my life would have been completely different. And I just think it's so beautifully written and so beautifully done. There's no fat on there. Every scene contributes to this building of, you know, this sort of reflection on what her life could have been if things had turned out different. And it's just amazingly assured, considering it's a first feature.
There's a word in Korean, inyeon. It means providence or fate.
Do you believe in that?
That's just something Koreans say to seduce them. Like,
what a good story this is. Childhood sweethearts who reconnect 20 years later and realize they were meant for each other. In the story, I would be the evil white American husband standing in the way of destiny.
shut up. There's just this kid in my head for such a long time, and I think I just missed him.
Did he miss you?
Hands up! 와, 너다.
와,
와.
진짜 와다.
와. Come down and it's sure got a feel about it. Son, and the way you move makes me feel like
좋다.
without you. 오가.
그냥 너랑 얘기한 거.
The guy flew 13 hours to be here. I'm not going to tell you that you can't see him or something.
만약에 네가 한국을 떠나지 않았다면 내가 널 찾았을까? 우리가 사귀었을까? 헤어졌을까? 부부가 됐을까? 아이들을 가졌을까?
너는 나를 왜 찾았어?
한 번 더 보고 싶었어.
If two strangers walk by each other in the street and their clothes accidentally brush, that means there have been 8,000 layers of inyeon between them. Want you to stay. Want you to stay.
Sounds like that's the reason it's pretty much at the top of a lot of people's best of the year list. I've not heard anyone have a bad word to say about this film.
Yeah, funnily enough, I think it's not on Sight and Sounds.
Is it not?
It's not actually in the list at all. I think one of the big ones. So it's interesting.
What do they know?
Maybe it's considered a little bit too sweet and naive and in that sense. But yeah.
Well, yeah, it sounds great, and it has been on. It's sort of been circling, and because I knew you loved it, and I was trying to see it before we taped, but I didn't get to it. So it's probably one I'll pick up on again if I get some time over the break.
Yeah,
because again, you've sold me on it again.
Yeah,
as you did before.
Great. So let's get to our final ones. What have you got next?
So the last one is Aki Kaurismäki's Fallen Leaves, which is just a joy. I mean, it's absolutely joyous. It's a love story. It links to the Eight Mountains, I think, in the sense of the characters have no place in the world, really. They are kind of out of place. So it's the story of a woman who works in a supermarket, and then works she's kind of, just essentially kind of temporary worker, and a kind of alcoholic construction worker, metal worker, who kind of fall in love. That's it, really. It's a move away from the kind of the explicit engagement with the lives of migrants, that's been a feature of Kaurismäki's last few films, and so two Finnish characters, still very much kind of on the fringes and out of place in the modern world, and the kind of political concern, the large political concern for Kaurismäki is to do with the war in Ukraine, obviously given sort of Finland's geographical proximity to that. But he's still just kind of effortless chronicler of working class life, and people who kind of sort of sit outside those kind of privileged spheres of kind of education and opportunity. But it's such a simple film. It's so beautifully told. The thing I wanted to sort of mention about it is this thing that he does in this kind of in a section of the film, which is basically almost, and again, he's a kind of, he's an older filmmaker now, and I'm not sure how many films he has left. He doesn't travel, and he decides to sort of share his cinephilia in a variety of forms. So they finally get to go on a date, and they go to the cinema and they watch Jim Jarmusch's The Dead Don't Die. And because obviously they're friends, you get to see it basically just cuts to a scene from the film, and they're talking about it afterwards. And she's like, come round for dinner. Here's my number. He immediately loses the number, like literally outside the cinema. He immediately loses the number. It blows away. And then he's kind of bereft, and he decides to go back every night and stand and wait outside the cinema. And each time he's there, we see a different set of posters outside the cinema. And it's Kaurismäki sharing his cinephilia. So in the foyer and on the outside, there's Bresson, there's Le Mépris, there's Le Cercle Rouge, Fat City, Point Blank, Rocco and his brothers, a couple of Chaplins. So he's just basically saying, here I am, here's my cinematic love and life over this kind of period of time. And there's a big poster that there's there for a lot, which is basically Brief Encounter, and it's him saying like, I'm doing my version of Brief Encounter. These people meet and then they can't meet again for ages, and it's like he kind of follows them on their life. But it's so sweet and so smart at the same time, and it's almost like I read it as a kind of like almost like a reward, for people who've spent a lot of time with his cinema and read a lot about it and heard a lot of people talk about it in a way that's like, oh, it's doing all this kind of stuff, and it's like, it's almost like at the end he's sort of pulling back the curtain and being like, this is what it's made of. This is who I am as a filmmaker. This is this journey that I've been on. These are the films and filmmakers that have had real, kind of influence. And it was so interesting to see like the American cinema of like Point Blank and think, oh yeah, like color and composition, and think of like something like Fat City, which is a really kind of empathetic portrait of, working class, underclass life, kind of like boxing as a way out of just, of kind of destitution. And it's like, oh yeah, these things which are just felt in the cinema, he's kind of lovingly revealing in this really beautiful part of the film. And then they do reconnect, and it kind of moves on almost back into the story. And I was like, this just feels really knowing. And I don't know if it was that intentional, but that's certainly what it felt like. And then, of course, just the rest of the film is just him. It's just like it's his unique synthesis of all of his influences, and he is a unique filmmaker. And to see a film as accomplished as this from a filmmaker who's been working that long was just thrilling. I was like, wow, that's someone who knows exactly what they're doing and how to do it, and hasn't lost any of the kind of potency over time. Like, if anything, he's kind of in a really rich run of films like The Other Side of Hope and Le Havre. He just seems to get better, which is so rare. So that was arguably my favorite moment in a cinema this year, was just sitting there being like, oh, look at all these film posters, and feeling the connection to the filmmaker. And it wasn't for show. None of it was like, oh, here's a hip film. It was like, it was really thoughtful, I thought, and just kind of, again, just elevated it to this other place, in a way that his films often do.
Tapasin sen pienemmän myöhemmin. Mentiin melkein naimisiin.
Miksi te menneet? Nätti likka, hiljainen tosi.
Hukkasin puhelinnumeron.
Se kieltämättä vähän haittaa. Saat kelvata, vaikka näytätkin heiveröseltä.
En tiedä edes nimeäsi.
Kerron ensi kerralla.
Mais la vie sépare ceux qui s'aiment tout doucement sans faire de bruit. Et la mer efface sur le sable les pas des amants désunis.
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't seen this one, and I had this is one of about 4 or 5 times this year when I've had a ticket for something and I didn't go because of whatever, work and all this. But it sounds like as well that also that, I mean, you're always weary, aren't you, when there's a film about films that is knowingly kind of trying to riff off the idea of my cinema fits within a canon of films. Because when, sometimes when Tarantino does it, it's kind of like, yeah, I know someone, nobody knows as much as me. That's how it comes across, do you know what I mean? Whereas it sounds like it doesn't do that here, which I don't think Kaurismäki would anyway. And yeah, it's one that I'll try and see at the cinema if I can when I get back from France, because I still do want to see it in the auditorium if I can. But yeah, definitely one to watch.
Great, yeah, and it does this wonderful thing where after they come out of the Jarmusch film, that if you know they're friends and they've been friends for a long time, it's kind of like, oh, that's a nice thing. But then the characters kind of undermine that with the dialogue, which is so funny.
Right.
So it just works beautifully. It's like, don't take this too kind of seriously or kind of navel gazing. Like it works really well. Yeah. So yeah, what's your final film to chat about before we head off into the new year?
So yeah, I was thinking because like I did have The Eight Mountains and Unrest were in the conversation in my mind anyway. But the other thing that happened was I was trying again to catch up with a few films that I hadn't seen, and that's always a problem I think at the end of the year when you batch like 4 or 5 together and you think, is any of them really going to affect you in any way when you do that, because you try to get through them basically. But my last film is May December by Todd Haynes, and it's not. I just didn't expect to like it as much as I did. And because I saw it recently, is this a sort of recency bias thing? And Todd Haynes I think is an excellent filmmaker, but he's not a filmmaker that I would just sort of put on a list of, here are 10 filmmakers whose movies kind of define my cinephilia. Do you know what I mean? I think Carol's great, Velvet Goldmine. I think Dark Waters is underappreciated, but I think here he's kind of marrying the stuff that he did early on in Safe with the melodrama of Far From Heaven. And I think Julianne Moore is obviously the sort of pivotal point there in terms of the working with her again. But he brings in Natalie Portman as well, and she stars as an actor herself who's researching the story of Julianne Moore's character, who is Gracie Atherton Yo, who, and the reason she's an interesting character is because in 1992 she was caught having sex with a 13-year-old boy called Joe Yu, who was a schoolmate of her son. And she did this in the pet shop where they both worked, essentially. So she was sent to prison, and while in prison, she gave birth to his son. Now, cut to 23 years later, she's actually married to him, and they have 3 children. So this obviously provides source for Portman's character, who comes into this environment and this sort of community, let's say, because obviously her presence in this community, everybody knows who she is, everybody knows the story, and so everything kind of revolves around the vortex of this woman and what she's done and this relationship with this boy, essentially, who's now 34. And interestingly, it's kind of like a key point that the husband is the same age as Portman's character. So there is a sort of kind of frisson of a connection between those two because they're of a similar age. And interestingly, I mean, I talked at the beginning of the episode about, we haven't sort of paid attention to the sort of Twitter discourse, but it's funny how there was a whole sort of argument online about the relationship between camp and melodrama. I mean, only film buffs kind of argue online and call each other out about what the difference between camp and melodrama is, right? But the argument was sort of, has Haynes created here a straight melodrama that has been misinterpreted as ironic and campy by viewers who can't deal with the emotional shifts? I mean, and again, I don't think it was... the film as a whole isn't emotionally overwrought. It's just that the central character is, wavers between these massive mood swings and is completely, obviously a sort of traumatized character in and of herself. And there's this sort of question of, are contemporary viewers less interested in really being empathetic to the human suffering that they see on screen? So the defense mechanism of contemporary viewers is that they call everything postmodern and ironic because it means they don't have to face the emotionality that they're confronted with in say, a straight melodrama, which is essentially saying, my God, everything's so emotional, you know what I mean? So, but like I say, I think that there is this sort of underlying suburban restraint where, everything is performed by all the characters in some. It's like the worst aspects of Christmas get-togethers where you have to pretend to be civil to each other, when really you don't want to be, and all the sort of barbs and all the sort of questions, they are all implied and gestural, everything kind of slightly means something else, and the scenes between Portman and Moore are great for that, because clearly here are actors who are playing characters who are playing other characters who are then kind of making, subtle signals to each other that are about their own egos and stuff like that. So it's a really heavyweight clash of, acting chops in that sense. So it's great to watch for that regard, because they're both pretenders and they're both manipulators in their own ways, And there's this great bathroom scene in a restaurant where they're both talking to each other, but they're, fixing their faces in the mirror and obviously at the same time staring straight into camera as well. So it becomes very, very sort of theatrical in that way. And the cutting remarks are done as almost as if there's a knowing that there's an audience out there watching this, And Portman's character sort of takes her method approach to the point where the ethics of what's gone on in the film, you know, between the boy and the woman back in the day, because obviously it's a big ethical question. It throws another spanner in the kind of moral vortex of the film. But it leads us to this point where Joe, the husband, starts to confront the fact that this life that he has with this woman may be built on the fact that he was actually a victim. You know what I mean? Because he doesn't see himself as the victim, and she doesn't see herself as the victim. And Portman coming in kind of makes them confront this idea that he was just a 13-year-old boy. How could he have had any agency? Whereas she in her illusion sort of thinks that he was the one who led her, who seduced her, kind of thing. So it's a complicated, uncomfortable film, and any comedy in it for me is kind of sly and troubling, and therefore I can kind of understand why sort of younger, you know, movie watchers with their trigger-happy righteousness can't think of it in this sort of self-reflective way and put it down to sort of it being comedically camp, you know what I mean, to take it in that light sense. But I think it's worth, I'm going to go back and watch it again, because I think it's one of those films that has got a lot in it, and you need a second and a third watch to get that out of it. But it was in that sort of period of the end of the year where you're trying to sort of see things that you haven't seen, it stood out by a mile as being, you know, really in-depth piece of work.
How do you choose your roles? I want to find a character that's difficult to, on the surface, understand. Were they born or were they made? It's such a pleasure to meet you.
You're so sweet. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you for doing this. It's so generous.
Well, I want you to tell the story right, don't I? We're taller. You look taller on television, but we're basically the same size.
I'm basically the same.
Feel like things just settled down, and now y'all are making a movie.
It's a very complex and human story.
I think it's hard to trust that you're going to represent Gracie as she was.
I'm going to try. Do you remember when you first met? You came to the pet store looking for a job. Summer after 6th grade? 7th.
Why do you want to play me?
When they sent me the script, I thought, here is a woman with a lot more terror than I remember from the tabloid.
What would make a 36-year-old woman have an affair with a 7th grader?
People do see me as a victim of humanity.
I already have an idea of what it must have felt like.
What?
Sneaking around with you. I shouldn't have said that.
Why would you want to play someone who you think is a bad person?
It's the small gray areas that are interesting.
She's getting on my last nerve. She's just everywhere I look.
Why can't we talk about it? If we're really as in love as we say we are.
Insecure people are very dangerous, aren't they? Hello, Gracie.
Great. Yeah, it's one of my most want to watch of films that have been out this year that I haven't seen. So I thought it was a Netflix release. I think it might be at some point. You were saying it was on Sky.
Yeah, I think it is coming there.
Yeah, it's just not. It wasn't in time, but I'll definitely be seeing that when it lands. Well, I think that was a pretty good, in-depth, heartfelt roundup of some great movies.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed that. Again, it's a funny one. It hasn't been. I don't want to say it's not been a good year, because again, I don't want to do that positioning of, you know, where is film kind of thing. You know, everybody else that does that, and I think just sort of letting the films speak for themselves has been good fun. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing some of the stuff I think that's coming up very soon, and sort of getting on into that. But I feel like, you know, I don't know. I've talked to you about this before. I've been a little bit sort of in and out with stuff this year in regards to watching.
Yeah. Maybe that will be reinvigorated over the next few months of the year when you won't have this bi-monthly ritual to concern yourself with. So spoiler alert for our listeners.
Yeah, spoiler alert. Yeah, I'm going to take a little break. I think that, we've been doing this from 2015, every single, season, 2 seasons a year. We do take our summer break, but I just feel that, this season has been more tricky for me with work. I found it harder to get up for the organization of it and the watching of the films, in the sense of how does this all feed in. And I don't want to feel like that about the show. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to people who tune in and stuff like that, and it's not as if I've been pretending, it's the stuff that I've talked about, I've wanted to talk about, but I am quite tired, and I feel like I need to almost fall in love with film again. And part of it is to do with just sort of negotiating my time, and I feel like I need to just sort of focus on work and then have downtime and not have like 5 other things, that's after work on the side. And I'm trying to get various projects kind of to fruition and finish, and then sort of reevaluate, kind of what I want to do going forward, really.
Yeah, it worked well for me. I was really grateful to be able to take a break, and to have you sort of steer the ship while I was gone. And it certainly, I feel like my podcasting has benefited from that break, and I still feel in a much different place since coming back. So I appreciate that need, and you'll be greatly missed. It won't be the same without you, but I'll do my best to deliver an acceptable level of quality that befits your legacy in your absence until you come back.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to say, there is one. I do have to do a second episode of the Demons of the Mind for that research project. So I don't know when that will come, but what I'll probably do is just I'll make that and then drop it to you. We can have a quick catch up and chat on it, and then that will go out, because obviously I'd agreed to do that as part of being involved with that project. So there is one of those episodes to come. But I'm actually, to be honest with you, I'm quite looking forward to seeing what you do. Do you know what I mean? Because I think it's quite nice as well to sort of have a little bit of free reign to take it and not have to sort of think about, what about Neil? What does he have to do and stuff like that? And it's not as if, that I wanted that in some senses, but it just meant that, okay, so, what am I going to do? Was the question I was asking myself, you know what I mean? So I'm quite interested to hear the podcast and your sort of more autonomy now to sort of take it and do whatever you want, really, because I'm not going to, say anything about it. I'm just going to listen and say, oh yeah, that was interesting. That was good.
Cool. Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah. In that sense of it was really enjoyable to be a listener. When I did it, enjoyed your take on it, and hopefully you'll enjoy mine. I've got some ideas, I've got some things out, so yeah, I'll be back, as Arnie would say, at the beginning of February with an episode. But for now, this is the end of our 2023.
Great, and it's been great to continue working with you, Neil. Thanks to everybody who's contributed to the podcast. Obviously, people come on for free and give up their time, which we're always grateful of. Thanks to the Patreon subscribers for their continued support as well. It really does kind of help, because it's been going up as well, the amount of money we have to spend on the platforms to keep things going. So we do appreciate anybody who spends a few quid every month just to help us out with that. And I think that the space for the newsletter as well, there's always interesting stuff on there. We always get good feedback on the work that we do with the bonus material that you can get if you do subscribe.
Yep, and I'll be doing that as well. I'll probably do a little one at the end of the month, just to kind of to tide people over, and sort of set us up for the new year. But yeah, I look forward to you coming back on, but also, seeing what you do in that break over the next 6 months. But for now, thank you everyone for your continued support. This has been 2023 on the Cinematologist podcast. Thanks for listening.